Dog barks at a coffin. During funeral, when a man asks, why, the priest turns pale. A heavy silence hung over the village cemetery as the mourners gathered under the gray overcast sky. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh-cut flowers, a solemn mix that matched the weight pressing on everyone's hearts. The wooden coffin lay at the front of the gathered crowd, polished to a dull shine, its surface reflecting the flickering light of the candles placed beside it. The wind whispered through the leafless branches of the nearby trees, as if nature itself mourned the loss of Hannah Caldwell. At the foot of the coffin sat Duke, her loyal German shepherd, his golden brown fur ruffled by the wind. His dark eyes were fixed on the wooden box, his ears twitching at every creak and shift of the wood. He had not moved since the moment the coffin was brought out, his body rigid, his breathing slow but deep. Father Michael, dressed in his ceremonial robes, stood before the crowd, his hands folded over his chest, his face a mask of solemnity. His voice, usually calm and reassuring, carried an odd tremor as he read from the small, leather-bound book he held. His words echoed in the quiet cemetery, only to be met with the occasional sniffle or muffled sob from the villagers. David watched from the back, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He had not known Hannah well, only arriving in the village a few weeks ago, but he had heard stories of her generosity. She had taken care of the church's finances, managed donations, and was always the first to offer help to those in need. Her death, sudden and unexplained, had sent a ripple of sorrow through the small community. But David's mind was restless. Something about the way people spoke of her final days didn't sit right with him. A sharp, sudden bark shattered the silence. Heads turned, whispers rippled through the crowd. Duke had risen to his feet, his body tense, his gaze locked onto the coffin. His ears were pinned back, his tail stiff, and he barked again, louder this time. His growl followed, low and guttural, a sound that sent a shiver through the gathering. "Someone quiet that dog," a voice murmured from the crowd. But Duke didn't stop. His barking grew more frantic, his claws digging into the wet earth as if trying to pull himself forward. His movements were not those of a distressed animal grieving for his owner. No, Duke was warning them. Father Michael's face had gone pale. His hands gripped the book tighter, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Duke," he called, his voice forced into a soothing tone. "It's all right, boy. Your master is at peace now." But Duke did not believe him. The dog lunged toward the coffin, his front paws scraping against the wood as he barked furiously. A gasp rippled through the crowd as he began to scratch at the lid, his nails clicking against the polished surface. "Duke, stop!" one of the mourners yelled, stepping forward as if to pull the dog away. But no one dared get close enough to him. David moved instinctively, making his way through the sea of black-clad villagers until he reached the front. He knelt beside Duke, placing a cautious hand on the dog's back. Duke didn't flinch. His muscles were tight beneath his fur, his growling never ceasing. David followed the dog's gaze to the coffin and felt a strange unease settle in his gut. "Why is he doing this?" David asked, looking up at Father Michael. The priest hesitated. He is grieving." "This isn't grief." David's voice was firm. He had seen animals mourn before, but this was different. This was urgency, desperation. Murmurs spread through the crowd as the tension thickened. Someone whispered, "Maybe the dog senses something." Another, more skeptical voice countered, "It's just a dog. He doesn't understand what's happening." Duke let out a sharp, desperate whimper before barking again, his body trembling now. The priest's hands shook slightly as he turned a page in his book, his lips moving silently over the words before he forced himself to speak. "Sometimes animals struggle with loss more than we do," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. David wasn't convinced. He studied the priest's face, noting the sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cold air. "What if we open the coffin?" The words struck the crowd like a thunderclap. A collective gasp rose, followed by immediate protests. "That's absurd," one man said. "We must let her rest," an older woman whispered. Father Michael took a step back, his grip tightening around his book. "That is out of the question." "Why?" David pressed, standing now. "If it's just grief, if there's nothing wrong, then what's the harm?" The priest's jaw tightened. "We do not disturb the dead. David wasn't looking at him anymore. He was watching Duke, whose barks had turned into desperate whines. The dog was pawing at the edge of the coffin, his tail stiff, his breathing shallow. It was as if he knew something no one else did. The priest's fingers twitched at his sides. This ceremony must continue, but David wasn't ready to let it go. "Then tell me," he said, lowering his voice so only the priest could hear, "why do you look so nervous?" Father Michael's eyes darted to the dog, then to the coffin. His pale face had gone even whiter, his mouth opening and closing like a man struggling to find the right words. David felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. The priest was hiding something. Duke let out another growl, his entire body trembling with intensity. Something wasn't right, and David intended to find out what. The tension hung thick in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. The gathered mourners shifted uneasily, their gazes bouncing between Father Michael, David, and the restless Duke, whose claws scraped against the coffin in frantic desperation. The priest's fingers trembled slightly as he tightened his grip on the book he held, his knuckles turning white. The air was cold, but beads of sweat had begun forming on his forehead, glistening under the dim light of the overcast sky. His lips parted, but no words came out at first, just a sharp exhale, as though he was struggling to maintain his composure. David took a slow step forward, his eyes locked onto Father Michael's. "You still haven't answered my question?" he said, his voice steady despite the swirling sense of unease curling inside his gut. "Why does Duke keep barking? Why does he act like something is wrong?" Father Michael licked his lips, inhaled, and forced a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dogs. Dogs often struggle with grief," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "They don't understand death the way we do. He's only reacting to the absence of his owner." David didn't buy it. He had seen animals grieve before, but this wasn't grief. It was panic. Duke wasn't wailing at the loss of his master. He was trying to get inside that coffin. The dog's nails clawed against the wood with increasing intensity, his growls deepening, his body coiled like a spring about to snap. "Someone get that dog away from the coffin!" A voice rang out from the crowd, edged with fear. A few villagers murmured in agreement, though most simply stood frozen, watching, waiting. David wasn't done. His eyes flickered over the priest once more. He was fidgeting now, shifting from one foot to the other. Every tell, every nervous twitch, only fueled David's suspicion. He turned his gaze to the coffin, his own heart beginning to hammer. "Then prove it," he said, stepping closer to the wooden box. "Open it." The reaction was immediate. A ripple of shock coursed through the crowd, gasps and whispers bubbling up like a wave. Father Michael visibly flinched, his head snapping up so quickly it looked painful. His breath hitched, and for the first time since the ceremony began, his composed mask slipped. "Absolutely not," he said, and this time his voice cracked. David tilted his head. "Why?" The priest hesitated. "Because it is sacrilege," he said, his tone harsher now, more defensive. "You do not disturb the dead." David narrowed his eyes. "Unless they were never dead to begin with." A sharp hush fell over the crowd. The words hit the air like the snap of a whip. And suddenly, it wasn't just David looking at Father Michael with suspicion. Several pairs of eyes turned toward him, some hesitant, some fearful. Others, just like David, beginning to doubt. The priest let out a small, breathless laugh, though there was no humor in it. "This is madness," he said, shaking his head. "Hannah's death was tragic, yes, but to suggest otherwise—" "Then open it!" The words came not from David this time, but from an older woman near the front of the crowd. Margaret, Hannah's closest friend. Her frail hands clutched her scarf tightly, knuckles white with tension. Her face was lined with grief, but her eyes sharp with something else now. Dread. "If there is nothing to hide," she continued, her voice quivering, "then there is no harm in making sure." A murmur swept through the mourners. A few nodded, uncertain but curious. Others remained silent, watching the priest. Father Michael's throat bobbed as he swallowed, his jaw tightening. He flicked his gaze toward the coffin, his fingers trembling slightly as they fidgeted over the edge of his book. Duke let out a sharp bark, breaking the eerie silence. The priest stepped back, And that was all the confirmation David needed. "Get the coffin open," David ordered. The pallbearers, uncertain and glancing between each other, hesitated. One of them, a burly man named Samuel, rubbed a hand over his face, sighing. "This isn't right," he muttered, but the unease in his voice suggested he wasn't talking about opening the coffin. He was talking about whatever they were about to find inside. Still, under the weight of dozens of expectant eyes, Samuel stepped forward. With great care, he unlatched the metal clasp, keeping the lid shut. The tension was suffocating. The air felt thick, the kind of stillness that preceded a storm. David's pulse thundered in his ears as Samuel and another man lifted the wooden lid inch by inch. The hinges creaked, and then a gasp. A woman screamed. The coffin was empty. Silence. Then all at once, chaos. Mourners reeled back, hands clutched to their mouths in shock. Margaret swayed as if she might faint, her breathing ragged. Several villagers murmured in horror, while others demanded answers. "Where is she?" a man cried, his face pale. "What kind of sick joke is this?" David didn't move. He was staring into the coffin, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Or rather, what he wasn't seeing. Hannah was gone. There was no body, no sign of decomposition, no scent of death. Just the cold, empty, velvet-lined interior. But something was there. Something small, tucked neatly in the corner of the coffin. A scrap of fabric. Duke whined and sniffed at it, his ears twitching. David hesitated before reaching in, pulling it out with careful fingers. The cloth was dark and slightly torn, but there, stitched into the fabric in small, neat lettering, was a name. It wasn't Hannah's. It was Father Michael's. The priest stumbled back. I don't... He looked around wildly, as if searching for an escape, his face ghostly white. The murmurs of the villagers had turned angry now, confused, demanding. David turned slowly to face him. His grip on the fabric tightened, his jaw clenched. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. The priest said nothing. Duke, as if sensing the truth was about to surface, let out a low growl. The crowd pressed forward, their fear morphing into something stronger. Doubt, suspicion. David didn't take his eyes off the priest. He took one step forward, then another. Father Michael's breath hitched, and then, without a word, he ran. Father Michael bolted. His ceremonial robes billowed behind him as he stumbled down the uneven dirt path leading away from the cemetery, his breath ragged, his movements frantic, his body betraying the fear that had finally taken hold. The shocked murmurs of the crowd turned into gasps and shouts as they watched their priest, their trusted man of faith, flee like a guilty man caught in the act. David didn't hesitate. He took off after him, his boots pounding against the damp earth. Duke at his side, the dog moving with unrelenting speed. The air was thick with the smell of rain, the sky above them darkening as clouds swirled in slow, suffocating spirals. It felt as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the truth to rip its way to the surface. Father Michael's heavy steps echoed as he rushed toward the church, his desperate flight making his once graceful movements clumsy, his feet slipping on patches of mud. He tripped, arms flailing, catching himself against the iron gate that led into the churchyard. The moment his hands grasped the cold metal, David seized the opportunity, lunging forward, reaching, almost catching the back of the priest's robe. But Michael twisted, shoving the gate open with a strength that belied his aging frame. He ducked inside, slamming it shut behind him with a clang that reverberated through the thickening air. David skidded to a halt, his pulse hammering against his ribs, his fingers curling into fists as he grabbed the gate's bars, rattling them. Locked. The church stood before them, an ancient structure of stone and wood, its towering steeple casting an ominous shadow over the graveyard. Duke barked sharply, throwing himself against the gate, his nails scraping against the iron, his growl rolling deep from his chest. Michael's chest heaved as he turned, his wild eyes darting between David and the crowd that had now gathered behind them. The villagers, once hesitant, were now bold with anger, their faces twisted in expressions of disbelief and betrayal. Margaret stood at the front, Her wrinkled hands clenched together as though in prayer, her lips parted in silent horror. "Father," she whispered, but there was no reverence in her voice. Only confusion, only heartbreak. Michael took a step back, shaking his head. You don't understand," he stammered, his voice barely audible. His gaze darted to David. "You have no idea what you're meddling in." David's fingers curled tighter around the bars. "Then explain it." Michael hesitated. His grip on his book trembled. Then, like a man making a split-second decision, he turned and ran into the church, the heavy wooden doors slamming shut behind him. David didn't wait. His shoulder crashed against the iron gate, but the lock held firm. The villagers pressed closer, their collective breath rising in nervous anticipation. Samuel, the burly man who had helped open the coffin, stepped forward. "Move," he muttered, his deep voice filled with quiet rage. He reached into his pocket, pulled out an old rusted key, and jammed it into the lock. It took a second, then there was a metallic click. The gate swung open. David didn't look back. He rushed forward, shoving through the graveyard, through the overgrown weeds that twisted between crumbling tombstones, Duke matching his every step. The church doors loomed before him, towering and silent, as though the building itself was reluctant to reveal its secrets. He grasped the iron handles and pushed. The doors groaned open. The inside of the church was dimly lit, flickering candlelight casting uneasy shadows along the stone walls. The scent of old wood, incense, and something damp filled David's nose. His boots echoed against the floor as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the long rows of pews, the altar at the far end, the towering stained glass windows that depicted saints and martyrs in eerie frozen poses. Duke's ears perked. His head snapped toward the left wing of the church, his muscles tensing. Then he lunged. David followed without hesitation, running through the narrow corridor that led deeper into the church. The hallway twisted and turned, lined with ancient paintings and wooden doors that had long since warped with age. A noise, the scuffling of hurried footsteps, echoed ahead, and David sped up, his breath sharp, his heartbeat a war drum in his ears. A sudden creak, a slam. David skidded to a stop. A heavy wooden door at the end of the hallway had been shut, a thick iron latch locking it from the inside. Trapped. But Michael had trapped himself. David took a slow step forward, pressing his hand against the old wood. "Father Michael," he called, his voice steady, calm, despite the storm raging in his veins. "You're out of options." Silence. Then a shaky breath from the other side. "You don't understand," Michael's voice came, muffled, weak. "I was trying to protect her." David's brows furrowed. "Hannah?" A pause. Then in a voice that barely reached him, "She was never supposed to know." The hair on the back of David's neck stood up. Duke whined lowly beside him, his ears twitching as though listening to something David couldn't hear. David leaned in closer. "Know what?" Another pause. Then a sound. Not a breath, not a shuffle, a whimper. David's entire body went still. His fingers dug into the wood, his ears strained. And then, again, a soft, muffled whimper. Not from Michael. Someone else was in there. David's stomach dropped. "Open the door," he ordered, his voice sharp now. "Now." "I can't," Michael whispered. David took a step back, scanning the door. The iron latch was old but sturdy, the hinges rusted but weak. His mind calculated in seconds, his muscles tensed. And then he kicked. The crack of wood splitting echoed through the corridor. Another kick. The door buckled. One more, it burst open. The dimly lit room beyond was small, filled with dust and old relics stacked against the walls. And in the very back, chained to the stone floor, her wrists raw, her face pale, her body thin but alive. Hannah. David's breath caught, his entire body locked in place. Duke let out a sharp bark. Hannah's wide, exhausted eyes lifted. And Father Michael? He fell to his knees, a broken man, staring at the one truth he could no longer hide. The room was thick with dust and the suffocating scent of old wood, the air damp as if it had been trapped within these stone walls for years. A single candle flickered weakly on a nearby shelf, casting unsteady shadows that danced along the cracks in the walls, its dim glow barely enough to illuminate the frail figure at the back of the room. Hannah, alive. David's pulse thundered in his ears as he took a slow step forward, his breath caught somewhere in his chest, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Her wrists were bound in rusted chains, the metal biting into her skin, her hands limp against the cold stone floor. Her once vibrant blue eyes were now hollow, sunken, barely holding on to consciousness. Yet the moment Duke let out a sharp, urgent bark, her gaze flickered, lifting toward the dog as if she recognized the sound, as if she had been waiting for it. Father Michael collapsed onto the floor beside the broken door, his head bowed, his hands gripping his hair, his entire body trembling, as if his own skeleton could no longer support the weight of his secrets. "It wasn't supposed to be this way," he whispered, his voice hoarse, cracking under the pressure of guilt. I tried to stop it." His words barely reached David, his mind too fixated on Hannah, on the horrifying realization that the coffin had not been empty because of some mistake or grave robbery. It had been empty because she had never been dead to begin with. David rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside Hannah, his hands moving on instinct to check for a pulse, to confirm that she was really there and not some terrible illusion. Her skin was ice cold, her breathing shallow, each rise and fall of her chest a fragile thing that looked as though it might stop at any moment. "Hannah," he said, his voice softer now, urgent but gentle, his fingers brushing the side of her face. "Can you hear me?" Her lips parted, dry and cracked, and a sound escaped, a weak, raspy whisper, barely more than a breath. "Duke!" Duke whined lowly, pressing his wet nose against her cheek, his body tense, as if trying to shield her from whatever horrors had unfolded within these walls. David's stomach clenched, his rage simmering beneath his skin, like wildfire ready to consume anything in its path. His hands moved to the chains, tugging at them, testing their strength, but the rusted iron held firm, a cruel reminder of how long she had been trapped here. "Where's the key?" he demanded, his head snapping toward Michael, his patience gone, his voice no longer controlled. Michael didn't move. He sat there, hunched over himself like a man whose soul had already rotted away, his face buried in his hands. I don't have it," he muttered, barely audible. "I wasn't the one who locked her here." David's vision darkened at the edges, his frustration mounting. "Then who did?" The priest let out a hollow, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You think this was all my doing?" He finally lifted his gaze, his eyes red, filled with something resembling regret, but not enough to absolve him of his sins. "I tried to stop them, but they wouldn't listen. They said she knew too much, that she was a threat." David's stomach twisted. "Who?" Michael swallowed hard, his fingers digging into his knees. "The ones who run this town," he whispered. "The ones who control everything. The council, the land, the money that flows through this church." His voice dropped lower, almost conspiratorial. "Hannah found something. She came to me weeks before her death, told me she had uncovered discrepancies in the church's financial records. Missing money. Large sums, rerouted, disappearing into accounts that didn't exist. She was scared, but she thought she could expose it." His lips trembled. "And then she vanished." David felt the ice of realization creep down his spine. This wasn't just a case of greed or small-scale corruption. This was something far bigger, something that had forced an entire village to unknowingly mourn a woman who had never actually left them. He turned back to Hannah, his hands still pulling at the chains, but it was no use. He needed that key, and if Michael didn't have it, then that meant footsteps. Loud, heavy, approaching fast. David's body went rigid. The corridor outside, once silent, now echoed with the unmistakable sound of boots stomping against stone, the weight of multiple men moving in unison. Duke's ears perked, his muscles tensing as a deep growl rolled from his throat, his body shifting into a protective stance in front of Hannah. Michael's face paled. "They're here." David had no time to react before the door was suddenly kicked open, with a force that sent splinters flying. The candlelight flickered violently as the shadows of three men filled the doorway, their expressions carved from stone. their eyes void of emotion. They wore dark, heavy coats, their hands resting against the weapons strapped to their belts. Not police, not officials, but enforcers. The kind of men who handled problems the town council didn't want the public knowing about. The tallest of the three stepped forward, his voice like gravel. "You shouldn't have come here." David's muscles coiled. His mind calculated escape routes, options, anything that could get Hannah out of here before it was too late. But there were none. They were trapped. The enforcers spread out, blocking every possible exit, their movements slow, calculated, confident in the knowledge that they held the advantage. Michael stood, his hands raised slightly, his voice desperate. "You don't have to do this," he pleaded. "She's not going to talk. Just let her go." The leader's expression didn't change. "It's too late for that." His gaze flickered to David, studying him for a moment before tilting his head slightly. "You should have stayed out of it, outsider." David's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists. "Yeah?" he said, his voice low, dangerous. "You should have buried her better." The leader's lip curled in amusement, but there was no humor in it. "Doesn't matter. We'll just have to make sure no one finds her this time." He took a step closer, reaching for something beneath his coat. Duke lunged. A snarl tore through the room as the dog moved like a bullet, his powerful jaws clamping onto the enforcer's forearm before he could draw his weapon. The man screamed, stumbling backward, slamming against the stone wall as Duke's growls turned to vicious, relentless snarls. The other two enforcers reacted instantly. One reached for his gun, but David was already moving, his body fueled by adrenaline, by fury, by the sheer need to survive. He grabbed the nearest object, a rusted candle holder, swinging it with full force into the second man's jaw. A sickening crack echoed through the chamber as the enforcer crumpled, his gun skidding across the floor. David didn't stop. He lunged for the third man, who managed to grab him by the collar, yanking him back. But David twisted, driving his elbow into the man's ribs. The room erupted into chaos. Michael scrambled backward, his breath ragged as he pressed himself against the far wall, eyes wide with horror. Hannah, still too weak to move, could only watch as the battle unfolded in front of her. Duke refused to let go, his teeth sinking deeper into flesh, blood staining the floor beneath them. The leader let out a guttural curse, his free hand fumbling for the gun strapped to his waist. David saw it, and without thinking, without hesitation, he grabbed the closest chain hanging from the wall and yanked. The rusted iron came loose, and with it the key was cold and heavy in David's palm, its metal corroded by time, stained with rust and a darkness that felt almost palpable. It trembled in his grip as the chaos around him continued to unfold, the room echoing with the violent sounds of struggle, snarls, and grunts. Duke still held fast to the leader's arm, his teeth sunk deep into flesh, his growls feral, his eyes ablaze with a protective fury that David had never seen before. The other enforcers were struggling to regain their footing, their movements slow and disoriented, one clutching his broken jaw while the other swayed unsteadily, blood trickling from his nose. David's muscles burned, adrenaline coursing through his veins. But there was no time to waste. He spun around, his focus zeroing in on Hannah, who remained chained against the cold stone wall, her face pale, her eyes half-lidded, fighting to stay conscious. His fingers fumbled as he slid the key into the lock, the rusted mechanism resisting him, unwilling to release its prisoner. He cursed under his breath, his pulse thundering as he forced the key to turn, the metal grinding before finally giving way, with a loud, reluctant click. The chains fell away, clattering to the floor, and Hannah's body slumped forward. David caught her before she could fall, his arms wrapping around her thin frame, his chest tightening as he felt just how frail she had become. "Hannah," he whispered, his voice rough, urgency lacing his words. "We need to get you out of here. Can you stand?" Her head lolled against his shoulder, a weak, shuddering breath escaping her lips. "David," she murmured, her voice so faint he had to lean in to hear her. They won't let us leave." Her words were punctuated by a sharp, violent crack behind them, a gunshot echoing off the stone walls, sending a shock wave through the air. David's instincts took over, his body moving on its own as he twisted, shielding Hannah with his own body, his eyes locking onto the source. The leader of the enforcers had managed to draw his weapon, his arm outstretched despite Duke's teeth still embedded in his flesh. The muzzle of the gun smoked, the bullet having ricocheted off the stone mere inches from where David had been kneeling. "Duke!" David shouted. "Down!" The command snapped through the air with the force of authority, and Duke obeyed instantly, releasing the man's arm and leaping back. His body coiled, his teeth bared, ready to strike again. Blood poured from the enforcer's wound, staining his coat, his face contorted in pain and fury. But his grip on the gun remained steady. His finger moved to the trigger. David's mind calculated in a heartbeat. No cover, nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Only one option. He lunged forward, his body moving faster than thought, his shoulder crashing into the enforcer's chest before the gun could go off. The impact sent them both sprawling, the weapon clattering to the floor, spinning out of reach. They hit the ground hard, the force knocking the air from David's lungs, pain radiating through his shoulder. But he didn't let go. His fists flew, driven by anger, by fear, by the desperate need to protect Hannah. He struck the man's jaw, his nose, his ribs, his knuckles bruising as he landed blow after blow, not giving the enforcer a chance to fight back. But the other two were recovering. David heard them behind him, their heavy footsteps growing closer, their shadows stretching across the floor, and he knew he was out of time. His eyes darted to the gun. Too far, no chance of reaching it before they were on him. But Duke was closer. "Duke!" David shouted, his voice raw, desperate. "Get the gun!" The dog's ears perked, his eyes flashing with understanding. Without hesitation, Duke dashed forward, his powerful jaws clamping down on the weapon's barrel. He yanked it off the ground, the metal scraping against stone as he dragged it toward David, his movements swift and precise. David kicked the leader off him, scrambling to his feet just as the other two enforcers lunged. He grabbed the gun from Duke's mouth, the cold steel heavy in his hand, and spun around, his finger curling around the trigger. "Stop!" he roared, his voice echoing with a force that made the enforcers skid to a halt, their eyes widening as they stared down the barrel of the gun, now aimed squarely at their chests. Their faces contorted in fear, in rage, but they didn't move. They were caught, trapped, and they knew it. David's hands trembled, his chest heaving as he fought to catch his breath, his finger steady on the trigger. His mind raced, calculating, assessing, deciding. He could end it here, a pull of the trigger, a flash of light, and they would never threaten Hannah again. But the thought made his stomach twist, a bitter taste rising in his throat. He wasn't like them. He wouldn't become them. "Drop your weapons," he commanded, his voice cold, unyielding. "Now!" The enforcers hesitated, their eyes flickering to each other, weighing their chances. But Duke let out a menacing growl, his teeth bared, his body tensed, ready to attack again. They dropped their guns. The metallic clangs echoed through the chamber, a sound of surrender. David didn't lower his weapon. "Kick them over." They did, the gun sliding across the stone floor, stopping at his feet. He nudged them aside with his boot, ensuring they were well out of reach. Only then did he turn, his eyes locking onto Father Michael, who still stood by the far wall, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "You're coming with us," David said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You're going to tell everyone what happened. You're going to confess." Michael's shoulders sagged, his body folding in on itself as though he had been drained of all strength. "I never meant for it to go this far," he whispered, his voice broken, defeated. "I just wanted to protect the church, protect my position." His gaze flickered to Hannah, his eyes shining with regret. "I was weak. I let them control me." David's jaw clenched. "And you let her suffer for it." The priest didn't respond. He merely nodded, his head bowing in shame. David turned away from him, moving back to Hannah, who was watching him with those haunted eyes, tears shimmering in their depths. He wrapped his arms around her once more, lifting her carefully, cradling her against his chest. "We're getting you out of here," he promised, his voice softening, his anger giving way to relief. "You're safe now." Hannah's lips quivered, a single tear slipping down her cheek as she whispered, "I never thought I'd see the sun again." David tightened his hold on her, his own eyes burning. "You will, I swear it." With Duke by his side, his loyal protector, and the truth finally coming to light, David began to carry Hannah out of the darkness. The morning sun broke over the village like a promise, golden light spilling across rooftops, painting the cobblestone streets in shades of warmth that felt almost surreal after the long night of darkness. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of dew and fresh earth, the sky above an endless stretch of blue. It was the kind of day that once would have made Hannah smile, her laughter echoing through the market square as she greeted neighbors, her kindness touching every soul she met. But now, as David helped her down the church steps, her body weak and fragile, her eyes still haunted by shadows that daylight could not chase away, that laughter felt like a distant memory. Yet she was alive, and for David, that was enough. A murmur rippled through the gathered villagers, their faces pale, eyes wide with shock and confusion, as they watched the woman they had mourned walk among them once more. Some stepped back, hands covering mouths, whispers of ghost and miracle dancing on the wind. Others began to cry, tears of relief and disbelief, rushing forward only to falter, unsure how to bridge the gap between grief and resurrection. But Margaret didn't hesitate. Her frail body moved with the urgency of a mother reunited with her child, her arms wrapping around Hannah, pulling her close, her sobs muffled against Hannah's shoulder. I thought we lost you forever," Margaret choked out, her voice trembling. Hannah's lips quivered, her own tears spilling over as she clung to her friend, her body shaking under the weight of relief and pain. "I thought so too," she whispered, her voice fragile, broken. David stood beside them, his eyes scanning the crowd, noting the mix of joy and suspicion, the questions already forming on their faces. He had expected this. The truth was a heavy burden, and what they were about to learn would shatter the trust that had held this village together for generations. He turned his gaze to Father Michael, who stood at the top of the steps, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped, the very image of a man crushed by his own sins. His hands were bound now, tied by the very chains that had once imprisoned Hannah, his wrists red and raw. The village elders had agreed to let him speak before handing him over to the authorities. It was the least they could do, considering the weight of his confession. Silence fell as David stepped forward, his voice carrying across the square. "You were all made to believe a lie," he began, his tone steady, unwavering. "Hannah never died. She was kept prisoner by those who sought to silence her, those who wanted to protect their secrets." Gasps echoed through the crowd, faces paling, eyes widening in disbelief. He felt their fear, their confusion, but he didn't stop. She discovered corruption within the church, money stolen, embezzled by people she trusted. His eyes flicked to Father Michael, whose face contorted in shame. She confronted them, and they chose to make her disappear. Murmurs grew louder, the villagers exchanging horrified glances, their trust unraveling before their eyes. Margaret looked up, her face twisted in grief and betrayal. "Michael, how could you?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "You baptized our children. You buried our loved ones. You were meant to guide us." Tears glistened in her eyes. "And you did this?" Father Michael looked up, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "I was weak," he confessed, his voice trembling. "I feared losing my power, my place in this community. When they approached me, when they showed me how deep the corruption went, I felt trapped, complicit. They threatened to ruin me if I spoke out." His shoulders sagged. "I convinced myself that staying silent would protect the church, but all I did was betray everything I stood for." His eyes met Hannah's, and his voice broke. "I betrayed you." Hannah's body tensed, her hands tightening around Margaret's shoulders as she looked up at the man who had been her captor. Her lips parted, a tremor running through her, but when she spoke, her voice was stronger than David had expected. "You left me to die," she whispered, the accusation heavy with pain. "You let them lock me away, let them erase me, and you stood there and lied to everyone, lied to my friends, to my family, to my dog." Her voice wavered, tears slipping down her face. "You stole my life." Michael's knees buckled, his body sinking to the stone steps, his head bowing so low that his forehead touched the ground. "I cannot ask for your forgiveness," he said, his voice raw, broken, "but I am sorry. For everything." A cold wind swept through the square, rustling leaves carrying away his words. The villagers stood in stunned silence, the weight of betrayal settling heavy upon them. David felt their anger simmering beneath the surface, their disbelief hardening into resentment. But then a voice rose above the whispers. A woman at the back, her face tear-streaked but resolute. "We believed in you," she said, her voice firm. "We trusted you." Others nodded, anger mixing with hurt. "You were supposed to protect us," another man shouted. "How do we trust again?" David felt the question resonate through the crowd, the wound too fresh, too deep to be healed by simple words. He took a breath, his voice carrying once more. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight, but the truth had to be told. The darkness had to be dragged into the light. He looked down at Duke, who stood by his side, his tail low, his eyes bright and vigilant. And it was Duke who led us to it. He never gave up on Hannah. He knew she was alive even when no one else did. He placed his hand on the dog's head, his voice softening. It was his loyalty that saved her. The villagers' eyes shifted to Duke, their anger softening as they looked at the dog who had mourned so fiercely, who had refused to leave his master's side. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Good boy," and a murmur of agreement followed. Margaret tightened her arms around Hannah, her voice steady now. "We have a lot to rebuild, but we'll do it together, as a community." She looked at David, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thanks to you." David shook his head. "Number thanks to Duke." The dog's ears perked, his tail wagging hesitantly, his eyes flicking to Hannah. She smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen, her hand reaching out to ruffle his fur. "You saved me, boy," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You never gave up." The sun climbed higher, warming the square, chasing away the lingering shadows. As the villagers began to gather around Hannah, surrounding her with love and relief, David stood back, his chest tightening as he watched the community begin to heal. Duke leaned against his leg, his warmth a steady comfort, his loyalty unwavering. Together they had brought the truth to light, and together they would help the village find hope once more. This story reminds us of the power of truth and the unwavering bond of loyalty. Duke's determination to protect his owner revealed the darkness hidden beneath a veil of trust, proving that even the smallest voice, whether it be a bark or a whisper, can shatter the strongest of lies. It teaches us that courage isn't just about confronting villains. Sometimes it's about facing the uncomfortable truths within our own communities. It also shows us that redemption is only possible through accountability and honesty, no matter how painful. At its heart, this story celebrates resilience, the courage to stand up for what's right, the strength to seek justice, and the hope that healing is possible even after the deepest betrayals. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If you were moved by this tale of loyalty, courage, and truth, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. Your support helps us keep these narratives alive. Until next time, stay curious, stay courageous, and always seek the truth.